Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I think the previous intervention has really set the frame for this one and set the tone, and I'd like to start where Suhaini has ended by how states behave as humans. And this is where, like in today's world, where we have, it's undeniable globally, the state of human rights and the state of global governance, state of democracy has been facing a retraction. In today's world where democracy has been marked by political turmoil, political instability, fragile economies, weakened democracies, and ongoing political instabilities, conflict, consequences of climate change, complex human situation, as well as difficulties in implementing sustainable development goals. In today's world, marked by all these characteristics, where are we standing as human subjects? What are our agency as individuals or as our collective? What kind of programs or what kind of work can we do towards the realization of a human's potential? I would like in this panel to have more of a candid, more of informal conversations where we get our perspectives on current issues based on our experiences and open after the floor for participations and questions. I'd like to ask my first panelist, Zeina, based on your experience and your really vast experience, whether in Asia or globally, what do you think is happening now amid this landscape that might seem like a bleak picture, but I still believe, despite this, what sounds like a bleak picture, hope is still there. Does it feel like there is a broken social contract? What could we do? What are your general thoughts, if you may, please?
So thank you. First, thank you to CGS for organizing this very relevant, timely, and extremely interesting conversation. I really enjoyed the session so far, and I'm pleased to present. Again, my name is Zeina Olds, and I'm the Chief of Party for Democracy International Strengthening Political Landscape Project, funded by USAID. So, our project, Strengthening Political Landscape, we work with political parties in Bangladesh, the major three parties, around internal democracy and as well fostering intra-party tolerance, so tolerance between the parties. So I wanted to sort of take a higher level look at governance in the region, democracy in the region, and give some perspectives, as you mentioned, while definitely beleaguered, I think democracy is definitely not defeated, not around the world, and certainly not in South Asia. As a matter of fact, the South Asia region makes up 60% of the world's democratic participation. So an extremely important region when we talk about democracy and the progress on that. But of course, even as our last speaker mentioned, some of the challenges of COVID, we really, of course, saw as well democratic backsliding during COVID. There was already some backsliding before COVID occurred. And, this kind of exacerbated things to an extent, right? In terms of rising authoritarianism in the region. So if we're thinking about anything from, of course, the military coup in Myanmar to recent turmoil, even in Sri Lanka or Thailand, we're definitely seeing the divides. We're seeing how people are divided. And some of the powers that were taken on by certain governments during COVID, and some of those powers that still remain vested with them. And I was reading, of course, over the notes for this session, and one of the questions was, or thoughts was, has democracy even really taken root in this region? But I would say that the challenges notwithstanding, we can all agree that there are certain places where democracy is definitely well-rooted in the region. If you think, looking at India, there are literally artifacts showing electoral democracy thousands of years back in the sub-region and the subcontinent, in India in particular. And since independence, of course, India has continued on with regular elections. And then as well, you can look at Sri Lanka, right? We think about India, but as well, Sri Lanka is really the oldest democracy in the region. I mean, universal suffrage came to Sri Lanka way back in 1931. So, there is this sort of spirit of democracy in the region. But, while democracy is more than elections, I did want to touch a bit on the importance of elections in my chat, because really, electoral democracy is central to maintaining and growing democracy around the world, and I think that we should, address that important topic. South Asia is definitely has a mixed record when it comes to implementing elections, and there are definitely challenges faced with electoral democracy in the region. At the same time, you see in certain countries, for example, in Bangladesh and Bhutan, there's actually been a rise in the last national elections anyway in voter turnout. So there's a huge enthusiasm in the region when it comes to elections and participation on the part of citizens. That said, the region is also plagued by, issues of perceptions of electoral integrity. So, really citizens questioning that electoral integrity, and the electorate becoming increasingly apathetic. So while interested to go out to the elections, less interest on the part of particularly youth and women in terms of participating in politics. And of course, fundamental to this, you mentioned the social contract, in a sense that's really the question that we need to be pondering right now. Where are we with the social contract between citizens and authorities in South Asia, and how can we strengthen and build that contract? Fundamental to a democracy and elections is this concept of representation that reflects the will of the people and represents all groups and societies. But we know that that's a daunting task, not just in South Asia, around the world, right? But we're talking, of course, about South Asia this afternoon. A healthy electoral process is built on, there's sort of three fundamental pillars. It's the legislative piece, right? So is there a legislative legal framework that sets the groundwork for participatory elections? Do you have an independent electoral management body? And on the back end, do you have sufficient measures to put in place election dispute resolution? But beyond that, so, this is just sort of the overall framework. What I want to focus on here is this concept of women, youth, and how do we bring, a democracy that really represents the will of the people. And I want to focus on two things: proportional representation and leveling the playing field for campaign finance among the important issues to be considered to improve electoral governance. Why am I talking about proportional representation? Actually, in South Asia, there's a mix, right? When you say proportional representation, generally, there's the sort of first past the post. So, right, a simple majority means you win a seat. But where does that leave women, minorities, other disadvantaged groups, often disenfranchised and left out of the process? But in South Asia, there's actually a mix. And even in Bangladesh, there's a mix, right? They have 50 seats set aside for women as reserved parliamentarians. Right, so that's a sort of a mixed system. There is some proportional representation there, while the majority of their seats are first past the post. I think that we really need to look critically at what's happening in the sub-region, and there are countries such as Nepal that are really making strides in this area. For example, in Nepal, they have 110 of their parliamentary seats are actually proportionally attributed, right? So in that way, you have 9 different political parties that are actually represented in their government. So that's a great way to sort of bring about diversity. And I think we need to think more seriously about how to bring other voices into the diversity of political parties as well as groups, and that's a way.
Thank you, Dana. This is I'll come back to you, but this is a very good account of how there are some positive examples and lessons that could be learned from around the region where women participation, enhancing meaningful participation that goes beyond just the quota system, or where there is more effective, meaningful participation, which leads me to Faisal. I have a question for you, so I'm changing a bit the order here. So Dana has talked about and raised the question whether democracy has really existed in their region here, and what does it mean to have a meaningful democracy. If I look to places where, for example, where I come from in the Arab region, the meaning of democracy doesn't necessarily exactly mean the universality of democracy or the prerequisites of democracy in other nations. And social mobilization, for example, the pursuit for social, legal, and economic equitable change has been repressed in the Arab region in the wake of the Arab Spring, as everyone have witnessed. It brought, if anything, more of an iron fist that handcuffs not only those who are pursuing justice and democracy, but also threaten those who might think in the future of what could be a way to strategically mobilize for change. Amid that landscape, what are your thoughts on the question of democracy, and whether this is like a very broad question, but what are your thoughts based on your experience, especially in Asia, on democracy, and what are the prerequisites, if we may ask?
So I think I'll start by being a bit more vague and then being a bit more straightforward.
Being a bit more vague means answering
more
more the vague
level,
question that I asked, right?
More at the philosophical level, and then come down to earth. So there is a saying that only the paranoid survive, and the way sometimes we also pursue our world is that there's an end coming, whether it's democracy, whether it's climate change. And it's very important to also take into account the long-term trajectory of things. And with the human civilization coming this far, I am an optimist who thinks that the world is eventually going to be a better place, but with some short-term pains, whether it's authoritarianism, whether it's freedom of speech being curtailed, whether it's about persecution. I think eventually in the short-term process, these are going to be shorter and shorter, but within the human civilization and history, this might at some point turn to be insignificant. But however, I don't underestimate the short-term pain points, short-term suffering of the people, and that's when I think leadership plays a huge role. If we are talking about democracy, and if the philosophical underpinning of leadership is not based on democracy, then we do have a serious problem. I'm not saying that they should read all Plato or Aristotle. They need not necessarily debate on whether who is right in saying that human beings are fundamentally wronged or human beings are fundamentally correct. But the fact is, depending on how you see people, how you see the world, how you experience these things matter in your democratic leadership philosophical foundations. And at the same time, I might be really outrageous to say that we should also read Machiavelli, where he said, if I have to choose between fear and love, I will always choose fear. So I am not encouraging that, but what I'm saying is that maybe there is a time when we need to openly discuss about this serious fundamental philosophical underpinning of our individual leadership, and take it into a country level, take it into the national level, take it into the global level, understanding there is a diversified thought process, there's a diversified leadership process, and there's a need to be greater tolerance, and that's, I think, is the foundation of democracy. Now, coming to my own country, I think it must be addressed that Bangladesh has seen significant economic improvement in the last past decades or even more than that. And that is important. That is very, very that needs to be apprehended. But at the same time, we should not be bringing economic versus democracy debate as such. It's not like one overrides the other one to be prosperous. Even when we talk about economy, I think the economy needs to be resilient. And when we talk about resiliency during the COVID and during various other natural calamity in Bangladesh, we have seen the economy can be resilient. But the question is whether it's going to be sustainably resilient or not. And when we talk about sustainable resilience, this again, I believe personally that issue like democracy comes in, issues like freedom of speech comes in, issues like tolerance comes in, and you need to be able to bring in diverse perspective into a governance, into your accountability system, into your transparency system to make sure that your economy is sustainable. So it's not one or other. I believe that they both need to happen and they both need to happen concurrently for a sustainable development of Bangladesh. So,
Thank you, Faisal. And this leads me to my next question to Rani. Rani, Faisal ended his answer that became not very vague, but rather narrow on the issue of resilience. For you, as someone who works as a human rights defender, who works also with indigenous and minority groups, my question is, amid this terrain and then this landscape where your rights, obligations, duties, the question of governance are very intersecting and interlinked, how in your work do you think, and based on your experience, voices, needs, and priorities of minorities and those who are at the margin of the society could be reflected in any revisit, if we want, of a social contract, or if we want of an agenda of democratic governance? Like how the needs, desires, and priorities of vulnerable minority groups could be reflected in a broader democratic project?
Greetings and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you. Before I answer your question, I think I need to address what's been written on this agenda, that we have set the current political landscape of the South Asian region, where populist leaders and autocratic governments are in rife. And the leaders, and thanks to the leaders and governments who have been instrumental in dividing the cultural divide, increasing the cultural divide that we have seen in past decades, I would have to say, because they would need to be in the power, and they would need to think about how to be in that power. And the best way to get into power and hold on to power is to use people's sentiments. And I'm talking about all the governments in this region, and in expense of who? Most of the time, in expense of minority people, in particular, marginalized people who usually are not visible in the political landscape because they are so minute in the size, population size, compared to the rest of the countries, and who may try to raise their voice, but most of the times their voices are not being heard because different instruments are in play to put their voices down. We also see that governments in this region, if all of you have not noticed it yet, the laws and regulations that are adopted by one political party to carve out resistance of the opposition political party will be utilized against that party intentionally and brutally once that ruling party becomes opposition party. And I think that's one of the core characteristics of South Asian political governance culture, I would have to say, is that resentment, is to take revenge, rather than ensuring good governance, since we are talking about democracy and democratic culture within South Asian region. So every political party is aware of that consequence, that what's going to happen to them once they become the opposition party, if they lose the election and become the opposition party. And that is why we see that when one political party comes into power, any ruling political party that comes into power, they will try its best to disenfranchise the opposition party, or in some cases, they will try to obliterate the opposition party so that they won't be facing those consequences that, at first place they have put up in place. They try to do it in one term, and if it is not possible within a term, they will rely practically on rigged elections so that they can hold on to power until they can get the majority's approval of what they're doing. But in any case, since I'm here to speak about minorities, especially indigenous peoples and marginalized communities, I really need to ask that question: where indigenous peoples and marginalized communities are located or situated in this political landscape, where all the majority people are, scrambling for power and power politics? Where are we situated? And also, since I've got this opportunity, I would like to remember and commend all indigenous peoples and marginalized peoples activists who have been struggling so far to raise their voice and becoming visible in this practically invisible platform anywhere in this world. So indigenous peoples, also I would like to give some solutions. How we can make equitable distribution of power, democratic
In 1
power.
minute.
In 1 minute?
The solution.
It might be a bit difficult in 1 minute, but I'll try. Okay, so indigenous peoples always had this governance system way before this modern democratic governance systems came into place, way before the modern nations were built. It is based on their customs, it's based on their living experiences. And some governance structures are institutionalized, and some governance structures have lost its way because of so many myriad difficulties they have faced. And forcing assimilation of indigenous peoples have never produced any positive results in any country in this world. I'm not even talking about South Asia, I'm talking about in the world. It never worked. So rather finding a way to integrate different governance system into the modern governance system, it works, though not without challenges. There are many challenges, but we can work with them. So in India, we see that there are autonomous states. In Bangladesh even, we have semi-autonomous state for Chittagong Hill Tracts, where I come from, where formal governance system work alongside our indigenous traditional customary system. And Chittagong Hill Tracts regulation of 1900, it ensures that this semi-autonomous status stays so that every people in Bangladesh has equitable share of power. But unfortunately, there are some efforts that's been done where this CHT regulation that ensures indigenous people's participation in the governance system is being curbed. And 60 Accord of Peace Treaty that's been signed between the ruling party and Indigenous Peoples Political Party 25 years ago, that has not been fully implemented. But this accord holds major provisions, if implemented, would resolve some of the conflict issues that we have in our region, but more importantly, it would ensure equitable democratic power to Indigenous peoples and this other citizenry of this country. And the hope of seeing it fully implemented is quite fading away rapidly. So the point I'm really trying to make is that even those governments in this region, in this sub-Asian region, that already have the instruments in place to provide democratic power to marginalized people in an equitable manner, not always have the goodwill to apply that. So at the end of the day, it brings down to what the government thinks, how the power politics plays in for them to be in that power. Since what we think is that democracy is majoritarian rule, what the majority
Thank you,
people
Rani.
think.
Thank you so much. Did you want to say one last sentence? No. Can we can come back during questions. I know this is an issue that requires much more time, but to give an equal opportunity for our fellow speakers. Nurul, so Dana has talked about the 3 pillars for democracy, whether laws, legislations, executive power. Journalism could be a 4th pillar for democracy. Based on your work and your direct interactions and writing and coverage and your vast experience in the field of journalism, how do you see having a candid journalism that really captures the nuances and experiences of people with the intersecting facets of their identities could be a tool to promote for a more democratic governance? How journalism could serve as a medium that would enable, instead of being a disabler or a filtering, censoring mechanism that would suppress or silence people. If you could share with us your thoughts on this.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Chair. Well, if journalism is about providing public information to the public and critical analysis to them, and thus empowering people to ensure participation in power, then in the context of South Asia, I think I should begin with the politics of exclusion, aggression of neoliberal economy, and the challenges of journalism, something like that. Well, in Dhaka, I am very infamous of being critical of power. So, and I have reasons to be critical of power because power is a dangerous thing. It's an evil necessity. So before I enter the challenges of journalism, we need to see the state of affairs, political and economic, in South Asia. Well, charity begins at home. So I start with Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a nation state with 2 nations. One is Bengali and another is Bangladeshi. So Bengali nationalism excludes non-Bengali identities and people, as my previous speaker has highlighted some of those. Bangladeshi nationalism, which has boiled down to Muslim nationalism, excludes non-Muslims. So that's a paradox how Bangladesh is a nation state at all. Second is politically, I came to know here in this afternoon that our ministers, some of those were invited and they consented to come to here and deliver speeches. None of them appeared. So I inquired with some of my reporter colleagues are here. I inquired with my reporters what happened. Then I came to know that they have decided last night that they will not come here, although they promised to come. And CGS people adjusted their programs, schedules. So I was thinking, why they don't come? That's a private sector, one of the biggest conversation program, international seminar. Bangladesh should take pride in it, in the South Asian context, and the government should have helped them. The answer is, perhaps. They can't stand critical questions. They can't stand queries from people. Why? As to why? Say in South Asia, forget about the, beyond that, we the citizens of this country have to be told by others what is a midnight election means. So we had 2 elections that people here couldn't vote. So we are here in Dhaka and beyond Dhaka, fighting for an 18th century demand, that's restoration of voting rights. Those who have snatched our voting rights cannot stand people face to face. They love to deliver monologue. So this is Bangladesh. So we have poor people excluded. We have, by one definition of nationalism, non-Bengalis are excluded. And by another definition of nationalism, non-Muslims are excluded. And we have the rich and poor divide. The poor people are excluded. This is Bangladesh at the moment. If we look at India, our most important neighbor, there is electoral democracy there, but the BJP's Hindutva politics has excluded all the other non-Hindu citizens and identities. If we look at, say, Sri Lanka, they have not yet been able to decide whether it will be a Sinhalese state or it will be a non-Sinhalese state, inclusive state. Nepal, yesterday there was a general elections after they made their constitution. A few years ago, they became a republic, but political horse trading, factional feuds, and difference of opinion between the central and provincial areas they have not been able to settle, and the poor people are the victims of that. In Afghanistan, we can see every day, particularly the women are excluded. So, and in other South Asian countries, things are not that different. Maldives, even the participation of women in politics is less than 1%. So we, in South Asia, living in a situation where exclusion is the fundamental features of politics and economy. So under such a system, to come back to the job of journalism, of course, exposing them, finding out what are the reasons, and questioning them, questioning the authorities. The authorities in South Asia understand pretty well that the journalists will be doing this and intellectuals will be doing this, so there are a lot of laws. We call it a rule of journalism. The whole legal regime of journalism here is a rule of repressive laws. So, to be precise, the job of the journalism is to defy the state laws, those who are the lawmakers, not elected properly, and create consciousness among the people that Bangladesh or any other countries in South Asia or beyond that doesn't deserve this. So it's not about being a little tactical. It's about challenging the authority with adequate information and critical analysis. Some of us are trying to do that, of course. There are a lot of problems. And I know I have some friends in South Asian countries, except one or two among journalists. They are trying their best, but it's a really, really challenging job. We would seek help from all of you to stand by us, because if journalism fails, it's not the loss of journalists alone. It's the loss of the whole society, because without a free flow of public information, public cannot be informed truthfully, and without being properly informed, they cannot make right choices in terms of politics or economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very candid perspective. I'd like to move to my friend Jovan, who served as the former foreign policy advisor to the president of Serbia. Jovan, after hearing the perspectives of all the fellow speakers on pressing issues that are directly at the heart of challenging democracies, or the futility of the logic of law, or why democracy is not functioning to its best, there are feelings among of what has been shared of those subjects, or those subjects who are feeling a sense of anxiety, abandonment, or the logic of democracy as it exists is not working the way it should be. Being the only non-South Asian speaker, myself I'm not, but as a speaker, being the only non-Asian, South Asian speaker on this panel, and based on your experience, how do you see and how do you perceive the role that outside actors or stakeholders could play in contributing to the strengthening of democracy, the enhancement of the rule of law, or the advancement of better governance in a way that really fits the needs and priorities of the people who are at the center of it? So how could contribution be made in a way that is really compatible with what those are in need for?
Thank you, Zeina. First of all, it's my great pleasure to be in Bangladesh for the first time. Of course, since Second World War, there were several attempts all over the world to promote democracy. Some of them were successful, some of them were not. Some of them were even forcible ones by supporting coups d'etats in various countries and supporting armed rebels. But as a mankind, we have enough experience to be able to draw some conclusions and some parallels from these decades of experience of trying to promote democracy in different regions of the world. So I will have 6 brief points that I would like to share with you. My first point is that democracy can be supported from outside, but it cannot be imposed from outside. It cannot be simply manufactured somewhere and then exported. It doesn't work like that. Sustainable democracy has to be locally sourced. My second point is that regional settings, regional context, and regional knowledge is very important for promotion of democracy. If we are talking about a country that is in the region where there is strong democratic neighbor or neighbors next door, that would of course eventually help development of democracy in that particular country. And that regional knowledge should be used very much. My third point, good neighbors and other outside actors can support democracy in a certain country by offering economic ties, but by offering technical assistance and even by offering constructive political pressure to support internal reformers in that particular country. My fourth point, by strengthening economic ties through trade, through investment, through foreign aid, it is very important to focus on strengthening and building middle class in that particular country. Because once democracy emerges, it was proven that countries with robust middle class are much better equipped to sustain it. Very often, outside actors are focusing on helping country in question simply to promote overall growth, economic growth and wealth. And very often, the gains of that promotion end up in hands only of elites. And most of people in a country in question do not really get to benefit from that growth and that wealth. My fifth question, it is equally important, if not more, to support civil society and civil society organization in a country in question, especially grassroots movements, and also independent media. And above all, it is important to support the ones that are peaceful and non-violent ones. Promoting armed rebels, even encouraging coups d'etats that we saw in the past being done by some of major powers, never really produced sustainable democracy. It merely switched from one dictatorship to another one. So it is very important that those movements are peaceful and non-violent ones. And my sixth and my last point, unlike all of these positive measures, negative measures like introduction of economic and other sanctions proved not to help promotion of democracy in long term. Thank you very much.
Jovan, thank you so much for this very straightforward answer, which makes me think of the work of Edward Said on Orientalism and then his work on out of place. And how can we look at the plight of democracy today in a way that we're not out of place, but there are shrinking spaces, and how can we use our will and our power as human subjects, as civil society actors, as people with certain voices and powers to address these shrinking spaces and address any dysfunctionalities in systems. I think really 40 minutes is never enough to mention any, to go deeper, just barely scratching the surface with my distinguished speakers on this panel. I was hoping we'd have the opportunity to ask a couple of questions, but I think we're just running out of time at this point. So we're not only out of space, but out of time. So I thank you all for your very valuable perspectives. And please join me in thanking this panel and our distinguished speakers on their takes and perspectives. Thank you so much.